The rusted hull of the German U-boat that Aleksander Nowak's fishing trawler had accidentally struck in the murky depths of the Baltic Sea would transform the entire trajectory of his life, potentially ending 2 generations of crushing debt and vindicating his father's lifelong obsession with the legendary missing submarine U-3317. A Type XXI vessel rumored to have carried a fortune in Nazi gold when it mysteriously vanished during the final days of World War II, off the coast of Poland. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late February wind swept across Gdańsk Harbor as Aleksander stood at the edge of his family's weathered dock, staring at the gash in his boat's hull from the collision with the submerged object. At 39, with lines etched deep into his wind-weathered face and hands calloused from decades of hauling nets, Aleksander never imagined that his humble fishing vessel would yield anything more valuable than the meager daily catch that barely kept his family fed. The faded sign behind him read, "Nowak Fishing," its paint peeling away after years of exposure to salt and cold Baltic winds. What had once been a modestly successful family fishing operation was now barely surviving, with creditors circling like hungry sharks. Aleksander had exactly 96 hours to produce 550,000 zloty in overdue loan payments, or Baltic Coastal Finance would seize everything the boat. The small processing facility, and most devastatingly, the tiny cottage that housed not just his family, but the decades of research his father had meticulously compiled about the mysterious disappearance of the German submarine U-3317. Tata. "The bank called again," said Maria, Aleksander's 15-year-old daughter, approaching with a steaming mug of tea. The teenager's determined expression mirrored her father's resilience, a trait inherited through generations of Nowak fishermen who had faced the sea's harsh realities. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her eyes showed a maturity beyond her years, the kind that comes from watching your family struggle against relentless odds. "They want to know if we're still planning to contest the foreclosure, or if they should proceed with the paperwork," she continued, her voice steady despite the weight of their circumstances. Aleksander wrapped his work-roughened hands around the warm mug, grateful for the small comfort. The tea was cheap. The good imported varieties had become an unaffordable luxury months ago. "What did you tell them?" he asked, his voice hoarse from calling to his crew over the winds all morning. "The same thing Gdańsk Jacob would have said," Maria replied with a slight smile that painfully reminded Aleksander of his father. "That Nowaks don't abandon family legacies just because bankers think they're worthless." The harbor around them told the story of their decline. Where once the Nowak family had operated a small but respectable fishing business, employing several local men and supplying fresh seafood to restaurants along the coast, now only Aleksander remained with his aging boat, the Jacob N, named after his father who had founded the business nearly 50 years ago. The dock that had once accommodated 3 fishing vessels now supported only the Jacob N, a 42-foot trawler that had seen far better days. The small processing facility where catches had once been cleaned, sorted, and packed for distribution to local markets now stood largely empty, equipment gathering dust from disuse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Aleksander had never planned to be a fisherman. With a degree in military history from the University of Warsaw and an internship at the prestigious Naval Museum in Gdańsk, he had been building a promising career in historical research. His specialty was World War II naval operations, particularly the desperate evacuation of Nazi assets during the final months of the war as Soviet forces advanced from the east. He'd published several well-received papers on the movement of German submarines along the Baltic coast during the final weeks of the conflict. But life had charted a different course. His wife Hannah's unexpected diagnosis of multiple sclerosis 6 years ago had drained their savings with medical treatments not covered by insurance. Then his father Jacob's fatal stroke 3 years back had forced Aleksander to abandon his museum position and return to Gdańsk to take over the family business while caring for both his ailing wife and their daughter. The transition had been brutal. Aleksander's academic background in military history had provided no preparation for running a commercial fishing operation in an industry that had changed dramatically since his father's day. Large corporate fishing fleets with industrial-scale equipment had depleted local fishing grounds. Environmental regulations had tightened, limiting where and when small operators could fish. Fuel costs had skyrocketed, and market prices for their catch had stagnated. The kind of steady wholesale contracts that had sustained Nowak Fishing for decades had largely moved to larger operations with more consistent supply capabilities. Aleksander had been forced to sell 2 of their 3 boats just to keep the Jacob N operational. "There's something else, Tata," Maria said, hesitating in the way teenagers do when they're about to reveal something significant. "I found another box of geodetic Jacob's research in the storage shed. There are sonar readings in there that look recent." Aleksander's pulse quickened. His father, Jacob Nowak, had passed away just 8 months ago at the age of 78, taking with him a lifetime of stories about U-3317 and the valuable cargo it had allegedly carried. For over 40 years, Jacob had insisted that the submarine's disappearance in April 1945 wasn't the tragic accident that history recorded, but something more deliberate and far more valuable. "Show me," Aleksander said, following his daughter toward the small shed that had become a repository for his father's obsession. The small processing facility occupied the main floor of their waterfront property, a modest structure built in 1973 by Jacob himself. Designed with the simple functionality of a working fisherman's needs, concrete floors allowed for easy cleaning, while large bay doors permitted equipment to move easily between the facility and the dock. Now it served primarily as storage for equipment they could no longer afford to maintain, and more importantly, as the home for Jacob Nowak's extensive collection of historical documents, photographs, and artifacts related to U-3317. Every wall was covered with naval charts, historical photographs, and newspaper clippings. Glass display cases salvaged from a closed local museum held artifacts from various small wrecks the family had encountered over decades of fishing the same waters. But one entire section was dedicated exclusively to U-3317 and the mysterious circumstances of her disappearance nearly 8 decades ago. Maria led her father to a workbench where she'd spread out the contents of the newly discovered box. Among the yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes were several sonar readouts that made Aleksander's breath catch in his throat. These weren't the grainy historical images he'd expected, but crisp modern scans taken with professional underwater detection equipment. "Geodek took these himself?" Aleksander asked, studying the images of what appeared to be a large submarine hull resting on the seabed. The sonar scan showed remarkable detail, the distinctive teardrop hull of a Type XXI U-boat, still largely intact despite decades underwater, even what looked like the conning tower and deck gun. "Look at the back," Maria said, handing her father one of the readouts. In his father's distinctive handwriting, U-3317, coordinate grid R9M24, 82 meters, October 2022. They were all wrong about where she went down. Not off Bornholm Island, but here, exactly where the Wehrmacht Naval Dispatch said she'd be. Aleksander stared at the sonar reading, his military historian's training automatically analyzing the vessel's construction and condition. The hull appeared remarkably well preserved, which made sense in the relatively cold waters of the Baltic at that depth. The distinctive construction methods matched historical descriptions of the Type XXI U-boat. He picked up another printout, this one showing what appeared to be the vessel's bow section. Barely visible through the sonar distortion was a pattern that could be the submarine's identifying number. "Maria," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If your grandfather actually found U3317, and if his theories about what happened to the Reichsbank gold reserves are even partially correct, we could save the business," Maria finished, her young voice carrying a hope that Alexander was afraid to feel, and prove that 2 generations of people calling Gdańsk Jacob crazy were completely wrong. Alexander moved to examine the wall display dedicated to U3317's history. Jacob had assembled a comprehensive timeline of the vessel's service record, from her construction in 1944 at the Bremen shipyard to her final documented voyage in April 1945. The submarine had been part of a desperate effort to evacuate Nazi assets and personnel as Soviet forces closed in on Germany's remaining Baltic ports. According to official records, U3317 had departed Kiel on April 24, 1945, bound for Argentina with a cargo manifest listing technical documents, prototype weaponry, and several high-ranking Nazi officials. She was last seen by a Swedish fishing vessel near Bornholm Island. When she failed to arrive at her destination, naval authorities assumed she had been sunk by Soviet forces or struck a mine in the heavily contested waters. But Jacob's research told a different story. He had spent decades collecting eyewitness accounts, naval logs from other vessels, and military intelligence reports from that fateful April. His conclusion: U3317's reported route had been deliberately falsified, and the submarine itself had been scuttled in a remote location as part of an elaborate scheme to hide looted Nazi gold from advancing Allied forces. "Look at this," Alexander said, pointing to a framed letter dated May 2, 1945. It was a reproduction of correspondence between a German banking official and a Swedish businessman, discussing the unfortunate loss of items of financial significance that had been entrusted to Captain Franz Lehmann of Coast U3317. The carefully coded language suggested something far more valuable than technical documents or prototype weapons. The financial crisis that threatened to destroy their family legacy had a specific deadline: Monday morning at 9 a.m., when Baltic coastal finances foreclosure proceedings would begin. Alexander had received the final notice 5 days ago, delivered by a courier who'd apologized profusely for bringing such bad news. The bank had been patient, probably more patient than they should have been given the Nowak family's long history in the community. But patience had limits, and 550,000 zloty in overdue payments had exceeded those limits. The debt was a crushing combination of factors. Hannah's medical treatments had cost over 210,000 zloty, beyond what their insurance covered. The business itself owed 180,000 zloty in equipment loans for nets and a new engine they'd purchased just before the fishing stocks had declined dramatically. Property taxes on their small but valuable waterfront location had accumulated to 70,000 zloty, and the remaining 90,000 zloty came from the funeral expenses for his father and various operational costs Alexander had put on credit cards just to keep the business running. Alexander had tried everything. He'd applied for business loans, but banks weren't interested in a struggling fishing operation run by a former military historian with limited commercial experience. He'd considered selling one of their 2 remaining properties, but the real estate market in Gdańsk was depressed, and any sale would take months they didn't have. He'd even swallowed his pride and approached his former museum colleagues about returning to his researcher position, only to learn that budget cuts had eliminated several positions, including the one he had once held. "Tata," Maria said softly, studying her father's expression, "what if Gdańsk Jacob was right? What if U3317 really is down there? And what if it really does contain what he always believed it did?" Alexander picked up his father's research journal, a thick leather-bound volume that Jacob had filled with meticulous notes over 4 decades of investigation. The pages contained submarine manifests, naval records, crew lists, and most intriguingly, excerpts from what Jacob claimed was a secret manifest of U-3317's true cargo. According to this, Aleksander said, reading from the journal, U-3317 wasn't just an evacuation submarine. In early April 1945, with Berlin surrounded by Soviet forces, a secret division of the Reichsbank arranged for several tons of gold bullion to be transported to Argentina for safekeeping. Jacob's research suggested that the submarine had been carrying at least 7 tons of gold bullion along with various other valuables including diamonds, rare stamps, and precious artworks assets that had mysteriously disappeared from German records. Just before Berlin fell in May 1945, the implications were staggering. If Jacob's theories were correct, U-3317 hadn't been carrying technical documents and Nazi officials when she disappeared. She'd been carrying some of the most significant financial treasures of the Third Reich, gold that would be worth over $400 million in today's market. But even if the theory was correct, Aleksander faced enormous practical challenges. Maritime salvage law was complex, especially for historically significant wrecks in international waters. He would need permits, archaeological oversight, and significant financial resources for any recovery operation. Most daunting of all, he would need to convince authorities that his father's 40-year obsession had been based on facts rather than fantasy. As the harbor lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Aleksander felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could sign the foreclosure papers and walk away, preserving what little remained of their savings and starting over somewhere else. Maria was bright and adaptable. She would thrive wherever they went, though leaving Hannah's doctors and support system would create new challenges. Or he could bet everything on his father's theories, using the sonar readings as evidence to file salvage claims and seek investors for a recovery operation. It was a desperate gamble that could either vindicate Jacob Nowak's life's work or complete the destruction of everything the family had built over 2 generations. "What are you thinking, Tata?" Maria asked, watching her father's face carefully. Aleksander looked around the processing facility that had defined his family's identity for nearly 50 years. The nets that had been mended by 2 generations of Nowak fishermen. The charts that had guided them safely through the temperamental Baltic waters. The photographs of successful catches that had built their reputation for quality and reliability. "I'm thinking," Aleksander said slowly, "that your grandfather spent 40 years of his life researching this mystery for a reason. And I'm thinking that maybe it's time to find out if he was as crazy as everyone thought, or as brilliant as he always claimed to be." Outside, the wind picked up across Gdańsk Harbor, sending waves against the pilings of their dock. Somewhere beneath the dark waters of the Baltic, U-3317 waited with her secrets. If Jacob Nowak had been right, those secrets could save his family from financial ruin. If not, Monday morning would mark the end of the Nowak family's connection to these waters that had defined them for 2 generations. The race to uncover the truth about U-3317 and the $400 million in Nazi gold that might have gone down with her was about to begin. But first, Aleksander would need to convince himself that he had the courage to risk everything on a dead man's obsession with a ghost submarine that might not even exist. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with sunlight glinting off the steel-gray waters of Gdańsk Harbor. Aleksander had barely slept, his mind churning through possibilities and impossibilities in equal measure. He found himself standing in the same spot where his father Jacob had spent countless hours studying the wall of evidence that had consumed the final decades of his life. Aleksander's phone buzzed with a text from Baltic Coastal Finance. "Final reminder, foreclosure proceedings begin Monday, 9 a.m. unless full payment received. Please contact our office to discuss options." He deleted the message without responding. There were no options left to discuss. "You're up early," Maria said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of toast. At 15, she had inherited the Nowak family's early rising habits along with their stubborn determination. "I've been thinking about what you said last night about Gdańsk being brilliant instead of crazy. And I think we should call Professor Kowalski at the university. If anyone would know how to verify Gdańsk's research, it would be him." Dr. Stefan Kowalski had been Aleksander's advisor during his graduate studies in military history at the University of Warsaw. A respected expert in World War II naval operations with connections throughout Europe's military archives. He had initially encouraged Aleksander's academic career before personal circumstances forced his return to Gdańsk. More importantly, he had met Jacob Nowak several times during Aleksander's university years and had been intrigued by the old fisherman's unconventional theories about lost Nazi treasures. "It's worth a try," Aleksander agreed, though he wondered what a respected academic would think of his desperate situation. "But first, I want to show you something else your grandfather left behind." He led Maria to a locked cabinet in the corner of the shed. Inside were dozens of folders, each meticulously labeled with dates, submarine names and locations, but the thickest folder was marked Reichsbank Gold Reserve Transfer Records. "Gdańsk didn't just research you 3317, Aleksander explained, opening the folder to reveal a comprehensive catalog of Nazi financial transfers. He spent years tracking down records of the Reichsbank's gold movements, trying to identify which assets disappeared from historical record in early 1945, just before the submarine sailed. The catalog showed a meticulous record of gold bullion, precious gems, and currency with notes indicating their last documented location and whether they had reappeared in historical records after 1945. What made Jacob's research extraordinary was his discovery that several significant gold reserves, particularly 7 tons of gold bullion from the Berlin Reichsbank vaults, had seemingly vanished from historical record just before the fall of Berlin, only to be replaced by copper bars covered in gold plating in later inventories. "Look at this," Aleksander said, pointing to a series of documents. "Gold reserve designation B1127 through B1183, 56 gold bars, each weighing 12.5 kilograms, removed from the main Reichsbank vault on April 17, 1945. Alleg for transfer to a secure facility in Bavaria." All 56 bars were replaced with copper fakes within a week, but Soviet forces discovering the vault after Berlin believed they had captured authentic gold reserves. Maria studied the documents with fascination. So the real gold was secretly put on U-3317? But when the submarine supposedly sank, they needed the fakes to cover up what had happened. "Exactly what your grandfather thought," Aleksander replied. If Nazi financial officials needed to protect their most valuable assets from Soviet forces, they would have created a cover story to explain their disappearance. A submarine disaster would provide the perfect explanation for why the gold never reached its alleged destination in Bavaria. The implications were clear. The Reichsbank hadn't lost these valuable assets in a tragic shipping accident. They had deliberately concealed them using U-3317's disappearance as cover for a planned protection scheme. The difference was that unlike paper currency or art, which would deteriorate underwater, gold bullion could remain perfectly preserved indefinitely, even in a sunken submarine. A carefully prepared U-boat deliberately scuttled in a location known only to a few trusted individuals could preserve the gold until the political situation stabilized. Aleksander's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Baltic salvage operations. His stomach tightened. Baltic Salvage was one of the largest commercial diving operations in Poland, with multi-million zloty contracts and state-of-the-art equipment. How had they learned about his father's research? Pan Nowak, a professional but urgent voice said when Aleksander answered. This is WWII from Baltic salvage operations in Gdynia. I understand you might have information about a wreck site that could be of mutual interest. Aleksander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I'm not sure what you're referring to, he said carefully. U3317, Pan Nowak. Word gets around in our industry. If you've located Le Mans' lost submarine, Baltic Salvage would be very interested in partnering with your operation. We have the resources and legal expertise to handle a recovery of that magnitude. Aleksander felt his heart rate increasing. I haven't confirmed the location of any wreck, Pan Wojciech. Of course not, Wojciech replied smoothly. But if you should happen to file any salvage claims or permits, please consider that Baltic Salvage has successfully recovered over 20 vessels from Baltic waters. We know how to handle both the technical challenges and the legal complexities of historic wrecks. After ending the call, Aleksander stared at his phone with growing concern. If Baltic Salvage already knew about his potential interest in U3317, how many other companies might be watching his family situation? Tata, you look worried, Maria observed. What did they want? To steal our discovery before we've even made it, Aleksander replied grimly. Which means we need to move faster than I'd hoped. The call to Professor Stefan Kowalski that morning marked a turning point in Aleksander Nowak's desperate quest to save his family's legacy. The respected military historian answered his office phone on the third ring, his familiar voice bringing back memories of Aleksander's graduate school days when military history had seemed like a logical career path rather than an abandoned dream. Aleksander, it's been too long. I was deeply sorry to hear about Jakob's passing. He was a remarkable man with an incredible passion for naval history. Thank you, Professor. Actually, I'm calling about his research. I've discovered some sonar readings that might validate his theories about U3317. There was a pause. You found evidence of the wreck? Potentially. Giadek apparently located the vessel in 2022, but he never shared the discovery publicly. I'm hoping you might help me evaluate what we found. Send me the images immediately, Kowalski said, his academic excitement overriding any questions about Aleksander's circumstances. If Jacob actually found Le Mans' vessel, it would be one of the most significant World War II discoveries in decades. Aleksander spent the next hour scanning his father's sonar readings and documents, sending them electronically to Professor Kowalski while explaining the financial pressure he faced. By late afternoon, Kowalski called back with news that was both encouraging and alarming. Aleksander, those sonar readings are remarkable. The vessel dimensions match everything we know about Type XXI U-boats, and the size specifications align perfectly with U3317's documented measurements. But there's something else you need to know. What? I've received 3 calls today from maritime salvage companies asking about my current research projects. Someone is spreading word about your potential discovery, and it's attracting attention from some very well-funded operators. Aleksander's heart sank. How is that possible? We haven't filed any claims or contacted any authorities. Information travels fast in the naval archaeology community. A single phone call to the wrong person. A conversation overheard at a cafe. An insurance inquiry. Any of those could have triggered interest. Aleksander, if you're serious about pursuing this discovery, you need legal protection immediately. File salvage claims before someone else does and document everything thoroughly. I can provide academic validation for your father's research, but you'll need experienced maritime attorneys and proper funding for any recovery operation. After ending the call, Aleksander felt the weight of time pressure intensifying. He had originally thought he might have weeks to plan and prepare. Now, it seemed he had days or even hours before larger companies moved to claim his family's discovery. We need help, he told Maria. Professional help, and we need it fast. Aleksander's salvation came from an unexpected source. Natalia Kamiska was a maritime attorney based in Guinea who specialized in Baltic salvage law. Aleksander had met her briefly at a naval history conference 5 years earlier, back when such conferences were part of his academic life rather than desperate research missions. "I remember you," Kamiska said when Aleksander called her office. "You presented that fascinating paper on Nazi submarine evacuation routes along the Swedish coastline. What can I do for you?" Aleksander explained his situation as concisely as possible: the financial crisis, his father's research, the sonar readings, and the growing interest from commercial salvage companies. "You need immediate legal protection," Kamiska said without hesitation. "Can you be in my office tomorrow morning with all your documentation? I'll clear my schedule. I don't know if I can afford..." "Stop. If your father really found U-3317, and if there's any truth to the Reichsbank gold theories, this case could rewrite World War II financial history. I'll work on contingency. We'll sort out fees after we determine what you've actually discovered." The drive to Gdynia took Aleksander and Maria through some of the most beautiful countryside in northern Poland. But Aleksander was too anxious to appreciate the rolling fields, dotted with birch groves, and the dramatic coastline that had inspired artists for centuries. He kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see commercial salvage vehicles following them. Natalia Kamioska's office occupied the second floor of a restored 19th-century building in Guinea's historic center. The space balanced professional functionality with historical character. Exposed brick walls and high ceilings complemented by modern furniture and state-of-the-art technology. "Let me see what you've brought," Kamiska said after welcoming them into her conference room. For the next 3 hours, Aleksander and Maria laid out Jakob's complete research collection sonar readings, historical documents, transfer records, and the comprehensive journal that detailed 4 decades of investigation. Kamiska reviewed everything with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to building legal cases from complex evidence. "Your father's research is extraordinary," she said finally. By late afternoon, they had completed the preliminary paperwork. Aleksander's official salvage claim for U-3317 was filed with both Polish Maritime Heritage Authorities and the International Maritime Salvage Registry. He now had legal protection for his discovery, but also a ticking clock. He had 6 months to demonstrate progress toward an actual recovery operation or risk losing his exclusive rights. "What happens next?" Maria asked as they prepared to leave Kamisov's office. "Now we plan an expedition," Aleksander replied, though he had no idea how to fund such an operation. "And we pray that Gdańsk was right about everything." The drive back to Gdańsk gave Aleksander time to reflect on what he was risking. Nowak Fishing hadn't just been a business. It had been the foundation of his family's identity for 2 generations. His father, Jakob, had started the company in 1973 after years of fishing for larger operations, using his knowledge of local waters to establish a small but successful fishing enterprise in Gdańsk. Jakob's success had been built on reliability and expertise. In an era when small-scale fishing was increasingly threatened by industrial operations, Nowak Fishing had earned a reputation for providing the freshest catch with sustainable methods. They had supplied restaurants and markets throughout the region, building relationships with chefs, shopkeepers, and local families who valued quality over quantity. Aleksander's inheritance had been a business on life support outdated equipment, declining revenues, and mounting debts that Jakob had hidden from his family rather than admit his struggles. His father's sudden death had revealed the true extent of their financial problems, forcing Aleksander to choose between abandoning his academic career or watching his family's legacy disappear entirely. "Do you ever regret giving up your museum job?" Maria asked as they neared Gdańsk. Aleksander considered the question carefully. "I regret the circumstances that forced the choice, but I don't regret trying to save what Gdańsk built. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are terrible." Like Gdańsk's theories about U-3317? Especially like that, Aleksander replied. Your grandfather spent 40 years researching something that everyone else dismissed as fantasy. If he was right, if U-3317 really contains Nazi gold reserves, then his work could save our business and vindicate decades of ridicule. As they pulled into their driveway, Aleksander noticed an expensive SUV parked across the street with two occupants who appeared to be watching their property. When he slowed down to get a better look, the vehicle immediately started and drove away. Tata, who were those people? Maria asked. I don't know, Aleksander replied, though he had growing suspicions. I think we need to be more careful about who we trust and what information we share. That evening, as he and Maria prepared a simple dinner in their small kitchen, Aleksander found himself thinking about the generations of Nowak, men who had maintained their family's connection to the Baltic. His grandfather had been a fisherman in Gdańsk before the war, who had lost everything during the Nazi occupation. His father had built their business from nothing, working 16-hour days to establish Nowak Fishing. Now it was Aleksander's turn to fight for the family legacy. But his battle was different from theirs. He wasn't just trying to maintain a business. He was betting everything on a discovery that might not exist or might contain nothing of value. He was pursuing a treasure that might be nothing more than an old man's elaborate fantasy. Whatever happens, he told Maria as they sat down to their modest meal, I want you to know that your grandfather was an extraordinary man who never stopped believing in the truth. If we lose everything trying to prove his theories, at least we'll lose it honorably. We're not going to lose everything, Tata, Maria replied with the confidence of youth. Gdańsk spent 40 years preparing for this moment. He knew we'd need his research someday, and he made sure we'd have everything necessary to find U-3317. Outside their windows, the Baltic stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Dark waters, hiding secrets that had remained buried for nearly 8 decades. Somewhere beneath those waves, if Jacob Nowak had been correct, lay the answers to questions that could transform their understanding of World War II financial history and save the Nowak family from financial ruin. But first, Aleksander would need to find the courage to risk everything. On a dead man's obsession with a ghost. Submarine that might contain the greatest Nazi treasure ever recovered or might contain nothing more than the dreams of a brilliant man who had spent his final decades chasing shadows beneath the waves. The next morning, Aleksander contacted Dr. Elgieta Makowski, a marine archaeologist at the University of Gdańsk, whom Professor Kowalski had recommended. If he was going to validate his father's discovery, he needed professional archaeological assessment that would stand up to scrutiny from both cultural authorities and potential competing claimants. Nowak, related to Jacob Nowak? Dr. Makowski asked when Aleksander introduced himself. He was my father, Aleksander replied, surprised by her recognition of the name. I attended a lecture he gave at the Maritime Heritage Conference in Copenhagen about 7 years ago. His theories about secret submarine operations during the final days of World War I were fascinating, quite unconventional for someone without formal historical training, but remarkably well researched. Aleksander felt a surge of pride in his father's academic reputation, something he hadn't fully appreciated during Jacob's lifetime. That's actually why I'm calling. My father may have located U-3317 before his death, and I need professional validation of his discovery. Dr. Makowski agreed to review Jacob's documentation, and by the following day, she had confirmed what Aleksander had already begun to believe. Jacob Nowak had indeed found one of the most significant World War II shipwrecks in Baltic history. These sonar records are remarkable, she told Aleksander during a video call. The dimensional proportions, hull structure, and artifact distribution all align perfectly with what we know about Type XXI U-boats. If this is not U-3317, it's a vessel of identical specifications from precisely the same period. More importantly, Makovsky identified several features in the readings that supported Jacob's theory of deliberate scuttling rather than accidental sinking. The systematic positioning of ballast, the absence of explosion damage to the hull, and the organized arrangement of cargo areas all suggested a planned deposition rather than a catastrophic event. With Dr. Makovsky's professional assessment adding credibility to his claim, Aleksander's next challenge was finding the resources to conduct a preliminary survey of the wreck site. The Jacob N wasn't equipped for deep water operations, and Aleksander lacked both the diving skills and equipment necessary to reach a shipwreck at 82 meters depth. He contacted several commercial diving operations, only to be quoted prices far beyond his financial capacity. Most professional underwater archaeology companies require deposits of at least 75,000 zloty for initial surveys, with full operations costing upwards of 300,000 zloty per week. When Aleksander was about to give up hope of finding affordable expertise, Dr. Makovsky offered an unexpected solution. One of my doctoral students, Filip Adamski, is a certified technical diver specializing in World War II wreck documentation. He's been looking for a significant site to include in his dissertation research. If you're willing to allow him academic access to the discovery in exchange for his technical expertise, it could be a mutually beneficial arrangement. Filip Adamski proved to be exactly what Aleksander needed, a 31-year-old marine archaeology student with extensive technical diving experience and boundless enthusiasm for historical discoveries. He arrived in Gdańsk the following day, driving a van loaded with diving equipment that represented the cutting edge of underwater archaeological technology. "Pan Nowak, Dr. Makovsky told me about your father's discovery," Filip said during their first meeting. "If this really is U-3317, it would be the most significant World War II submarine wreck found in the Baltic in decades." Aleksander studied the young man carefully. His diving certifications were current and impressive, his equipment was professional grade, and his academic credentials from the University of Gdańsk's prestigious maritime archaeology program were impeccable. "Filip, I need absolute confidentiality about this project," Aleksander said. "If word spreads before we're ready, it could attract unwanted attention from commercial salvage companies." "I understand completely," Filip assured him. "Historical wrecks deserve proper archaeological treatment, not commercial exploitation. My interest is purely academic. Documenting this discovery properly would form the cornerstone of my doctoral research, while ensuring your family's discovery receives the scholarly recognition it deserves." Aleksander decided to trust him with the full scope of his father's research. He showed Filip the sonar readings, GPS coordinates, and Jacob's extensive documentation about the Reichsbank gold reserves that may have been aboard the vessel. "These scans are extraordinary," Filip said, studying the images carefully. "The preservation level suggests minimal disturbance over decades. If this vessel is really carrying Nazi gold reserves that were sealed in watertight compartments before deliberate sinking, we could potentially recover valuables in remarkable condition." "Can you dive to 82 meters safely?" Aleksander asked. "Absolutely. I'm certified for technical mixed gas diving to 100 meters, and I've conducted archaeological documentation at similar depths. My equipment includes rebreathers that allow for extended bottom time and high-resolution underwater imaging systems specifically designed for archaeological documentation." "When could you conduct a preliminary survey?" "Weather permitting, I could be ready in 2 days. I'll need to prepare my equipment, arrange for proper gas mixes, and develop a detailed dive plan based on these coordinates and sonar readings." For the first time since discovering his father's research, Aleksander felt a genuine sense of hope. With Filip's expertise and Dr. Makovsky's academic supervision, he might actually be able to validate Jacob's discovery before commercial interests could intervene. That afternoon, Aleksander received an unexpected visitor. A sleek Audi SUV pulled up to the Nowak property, and a well-dressed man in his 50s emerged, surveying the modest fishing operation with the calculated gaze of someone accustomed to assessing financial value. "Aleksander Nowak?" the man asked, extending his hand. "Viktor Adamczyk, CEO of Baltic Development Group. I understand you might be interested in discussing the future of your property." Aleksander shook his hand cautiously. "I wasn't aware my property was on the market, Pan Adamczyk." Adamczyk smiled smoothly. "Everything has a price, Pan Nowak, and I believe in being direct. My company is prepared to offer you 3 million zloty for your waterfront property and business assets. It's considerably above market value for a struggling operation in this economic climate." The offer was staggering, nearly 5 times what the property might reasonably fetch in the current market, and far more than enough to clear their debts and provide financial security for years to come. The question was why a development company would make such a generous offer for a failing fishing business on a small harbor. What would Baltic Development Group want with a small fishing operation? Aleksander asked, studying Adamczyk's expression. "We're developing a series of boutique resorts along Poland's less commercialized coastline," Adamczyk replied. "This location has precisely the authentic character and natural beauty our clients appreciate. We would transform the property while preserving its historical connection to local maritime traditions." "What kind of development?" Maria asked, having emerged from the house to listen to the conversation. Her young voice carried skepticism that Aleksander felt proud to hear. "An exclusive hospitality experience with private boat access," Adamczyk replied smoothly. "High-end accommodations that would attract discerning travelers who appreciate both luxury, amenities, and authentic cultural immersion, the kind of development that brings jobs and economic revitalization to traditional communities." Aleksander studied Adamczyk's face, searching for the real motivation behind his generous offer. Gdańsk had been experiencing economic growth for years, with property values steadily climbing. But why would a savvy businessman pay premium prices for property in a remote corner of the harbor? "Pan Adamczyk, I appreciate your offer, but my answer is no. This property represents 2 generations of my family's work. It's not just real estate to us." Adamczyk's practiced smile flickered slightly. "Aleksander, I understand sentiment, but sentiment doesn't pay bank loans. You're facing financial ruin in less than 48 hours. My offer could give you and your daughter security and a fresh start." "We're exploring alternatives," Aleksander replied, though he wondered how much truth that statement contained. "Alternatives?" Adamczyk's tone sharpened. "What alternatives? You've exhausted every traditional financing option. The bank has made their position clear. Unless you've discovered buried treasure somewhere, I don't see how you can possibly raise 550,000 zloty in 2 days." Aleksander felt a chill at his choice of words. Buried treasure was an oddly specific phrase for someone discussing routine real estate transactions. "Pan Adamczyk," he said carefully, "how exactly did you learn about our financial situation? Bank information is supposed to be confidential." "Small town, Aleksander. People talk. When a respected family business faces foreclosure, word spreads quickly." But something in his eyes suggested more specific knowledge than casual gossip would provide. "Tata," Maria said quietly, "didn't we file those legal papers yesterday?" Aleksander's blood ran cold. If Adamczyk knew about their salvage claim filing, it would explain his urgency and inflated offer. Real estate developers didn't typically pursue distressed properties with such aggressive generosity unless they knew something valuable that others didn't. "What legal papers?" Adamczyk asked, his casual tone not quite masking sudden interest. "Nothing that would affect a property sale," Aleksander replied evasively. Adamczyk studied his face intently. "Aleksander, I hope you're not chasing some fantasy about underwater treasure hunting. The Baltic is littered with shipwrecks, but finding them and recovering anything valuable are entirely different challenges. Professional salvage operations require millions of zloty in equipment and years of legal battles. Thanks for the advice, Aleksander said, moving toward their door. And thanks for the offer. But our property isn't for sale at any price. Gdańsk's demeanor shifted subtly, the practiced charm giving way to something harder. Aleksander, I'm trying to help you, but my offer won't remain open indefinitely. If you reconsider, call me before Sunday evening. After that, I'll have to pursue other opportunities. As the Audi disappeared down the coastal road, Aleksander felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Gdańsk's visit had confirmed his suspicions that word of their potential discovery was spreading beyond academic and legal circles, but it also revealed how much might be at stake. A real estate developer was willing to pay 3 million zloty for their property. What might U3317 actually be worth if it contained what Jacob had believed? Tata, that man was creepy, Maria said bluntly. And how did he know about buried treasure? That's way too specific to be coincidence. I agree. Which means we need to be very careful about who we trust and what information we share. Aleksander unlocked the shed door, grateful to be back in the familiar space surrounded by his father's research. It also means we're running out of time faster than I hoped. The shed's phone rang as Aleksander and Maria were reviewing the legal documents Natalia Kamiska had filed that afternoon. The caller ID showed University of Warsaw, and Aleksander recognized Professor Kowalski's direct office number. Aleksander, I have news that's both exciting and troubling, Kowalski said without preamble. I've completed my analysis of your father's sonar readings and documentation. The evidence is compelling enough that I'm prepared to provide written academic validation for your salvage claim. Several key World War II historians I've consulted confidentially, of course, agree that Jacob's theory about the Reichsbank gold reserves is not only plausible but likely correct. That's wonderful, Professor. What's the troubling part? I've received calls from 5 different salvage companies and historical artifact dealers this afternoon, all asking about current research projects involving World War II submarines. 3 specifically mentioned U3317 by name. Aleksander's stomach dropped. How is that possible? We only filed preliminary paperwork yesterday. Information travels fast in our community, Aleksander. When potential discoveries worth hundreds of millions are involved, people pay close attention to even the faintest rumors. But there's something else you should know. Kowalski paused, and Aleksander could hear papers rustling in the background. I've been researching the Reichsbank records independently using university resources. Your father's transfer documentation was remarkably accurate, but he missed something significant about those gold reserves. What about them? They weren't just valuable assets. They were politically explosive. My research suggests that gold reserves B1127 through B1183 actually contained melted down dental gold and wedding rings seized from concentration camp victims. If that gold had been discovered by Allied forces in 1945, it would have implicated dozens of banking officials in war crimes. Aleksander felt the implications sinking in. So hiding these gold reserves wasn't just about preserving Nazi financial assets. It was about concealing evidence of genocide. Exactly. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Several major European banking families, who still wield considerable influence today, can trace their wealth directly back to these wartime financial arrangements. If your father was right about what's contained in U3317, it could expose financial crimes that powerful people have kept buried for 8 decades. After ending the call, Aleksander stared at his father's research wall with new understanding. Jacob hadn't just been chasing lost gold. He had unknowingly been pursuing evidence of Holocaust-era financial crimes that might still have relevance today. The stakes were even higher than he had imagined. We need to secure your grandfather's research immediately, Aleksander told Maria. Everything important gets digitized and stored in multiple locations tonight. As darkness fell over Gdańsk Harbor, Aleksander worked frantically to photograph and scan Jakob's complete research collection. The growing sense that others were watching their property made every sound seem threatening, and he found himself repeatedly checking that the doors were locked while transferring files to secure cloud storage accounts. The battle for U3317 had escalated from family, financial crisis to something far more complex in less than 48 hours. Aleksander was beginning to understand why his father had kept his discovery secret. Some truths were too valuable and too dangerous for ordinary people to pursue safely. Early the next morning, Philip Adamski arrived with his technical diving equipment, ready to conduct a preliminary survey of the wreck site. Jakob's success had been built on reliability and expertise. In an era when small-scale fishing was increasingly threatened by industrial operations, Nowak Fishing had earned a reputation for providing the freshest catch with sustainable methods. They had supplied restaurants and markets throughout the region, building relationships with chefs, shopkeepers, and local families who valued quality over quantity. Aleksander's inheritance had been a business on life support outdated equipment, declining revenues, and mounting debts that Jakob had hidden from his family rather than admit his struggles. His father's sudden death had revealed the true extent of their financial problems, forcing Aleksander to choose between abandoning his academic career or watching his family's legacy disappear entirely. "Do you ever regret giving up your museum job?" Maria asked as they neared Gdańsk. Aleksander considered the question carefully. "I regret the circumstances that forced the choice, but I don't regret trying to save what Gdańsk built. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are terrible." "Like Gdańsk's theories about U3317? "Especially like that," Aleksander replied. "Your grandfather spent 40 years researching something that everyone else dismissed as fantasy. If he was right, if U3317 really contains Nazi gold reserves, then his work could save our business and vindicate decades of ridicule." As they pulled into their driveway, Aleksander noticed an expensive SUV parked across the street with 2 occupants who appeared to be watching their property. When he slowed down to get a better look, the vehicle immediately started and drove away. "Tata, who were those people?" Maria asked. "I don't know," Aleksander replied, though he had growing suspicions. "I think we need to be more careful about who we trust and what information we share." That evening, as he and Maria prepared a simple dinner in their small kitchen, Aleksander found himself thinking about the generations of Nowak, men who had maintained their family's connection to the Baltic. His grandfather had been a fisherman in Gdańsk before the war, who had lost everything during the Nazi occupation. His father had built their business from nothing, working 16-hour days to establish Nowak Fishing. Now it was Aleksander's turn to fight for the family legacy. But his battle was different from theirs. He wasn't just trying to maintain a business. He was betting everything on a discovery that might not exist or might contain nothing of value. He was pursuing a treasure that might be nothing more than an old man's elaborate fantasy. "Whatever happens," he told Maria as they sat down to their modest meal, "I want you to know that your grandfather was an extraordinary man who never stopped believing in the truth. If we lose everything trying to prove his theories, at least we'll lose it honorably." "We're not going to lose everything, Tata," Maria replied with the confidence of youth. Gdańsk spent 40 years preparing for this moment. He knew we'd need his research someday, and he made sure we'd have everything necessary to find U3317. Outside their windows, the Baltic stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Dark waters, hiding secrets that had remained buried for nearly 8 decades. Somewhere beneath those waves, if Jakob Nowak had been correct, lay the answers to questions that could transform their understanding of World War II financial history and save the Nowak family from financial ruin. But first, Aleksander would need to find the courage to risk everything on a dead man's obsession with a ghost. submarine that might contain the greatest Nazi treasure ever recovered, or might contain nothing more than the dreams of a brilliant man who had spent his final decades chasing shadows beneath the waves. The next morning, Aleksander contacted Dr. Elgieta Makowski, a marine archaeologist at the University of Gdańsk, whom Professor Kowalski had recommended. If he was going to validate his father's discovery, he needed professional archaeological assessment that would stand up to scrutiny from both cultural authorities and potential competing claimants. Nowak, related to Jakob Nowak? Dr. Makowski asked when Aleksander introduced himself. "He was my father," Aleksander replied, surprised by her recognition of the name. "I attended a lecture he gave at the Maritime Heritage Conference in Copenhagen about 7 years ago. His theories about secret submarine operations during the final days of World War I were fascinating, quite unconventional for someone without formal historical training, but remarkably well researched." Aleksander felt a surge of pride in his father's academic reputation, something he hadn't fully appreciated during Jakob's lifetime. "That's actually why I'm calling. My father may have located U-3317 before his death, and I need professional validation of his discovery." Dr. Makowski agreed to review Jakob's documentation, and by the following day, she had confirmed what Aleksander had already begun to believe. Jakob Nowak had indeed found one of the most significant World War II shipwrecks in Baltic history. "These sonar records are remarkable," she told Aleksander during a video call. "The dimensional proportions, hull structure, and artifact distribution all align perfectly with what we know about Type XXI U-boats. If this is not U-3317, it's a vessel of identical specifications from precisely the same period." More importantly, Makowski identified several features in the readings that supported Jakob's theory of deliberate scuttling rather than accidental sinking. The systematic positioning of ballast, the absence of explosion damage to the hull, and the organized arrangement of cargo areas all suggested a planned deposition rather than a catastrophic event. With Dr. Makowski's professional assessment adding credibility to his claim, Aleksander's next challenge was finding the resources to conduct a preliminary survey of the wreck site. The Jakob N wasn't equipped for deep water operations, and Aleksander lacked both the diving skills and equipment necessary to reach a shipwreck at 82 meters depth. He contacted several commercial diving operations, only to be quoted prices far beyond his financial capacity. Most professional underwater archaeology companies require deposits of at least 75,000 zloty for initial surveys, with full operations costing upwards of 300,000 zloty per week. When Aleksander was about to give up hope of finding affordable expertise, Dr. Makowski offered an unexpected solution. "One of my doctoral students, Filip Adamski, is a certified technical diver specializing in World War II wreck documentation. He's been looking for a significant site to include in his dissertation research. If you're willing to allow him academic access to the discovery in exchange for his technical expertise, it could be a mutually beneficial arrangement." Filip Adamski proved to be exactly what Aleksander needed, a 31-year-old marine archaeology student with extensive technical diving experience and boundless enthusiasm for historical discoveries. He arrived in Gdańsk the following day, driving a van loaded with diving equipment that represented the cutting edge of underwater archaeological technology. "Pan Nowak, Dr. Makowski told me about your father's discovery," Filip said during their first meeting. "If this really is U-3317, it would be the most significant World War II submarine wreck found in the Baltic in decades." Aleksander studied the young man carefully. His diving certifications were current and impressive, his equipment was professional grade, and his academic credentials from the University of Gdańsk's prestigious maritime archaeology program were impeccable. "Filip, I need absolute confidentiality about this project," Aleksander said. "If word spreads before we're ready, it could attract unwanted attention from commercial salvage companies." "I understand completely," Philip assured him. "Historical wrecks deserve proper archaeological treatment, not commercial exploitation. My interest is purely academic. Documenting this discovery properly would form the cornerstone of my doctoral research, while ensuring your family's discovery receives the scholarly recognition it deserves." Aleksander decided to trust him with the full scope of his father's research. He showed Philip the sonar readings, GPS coordinates, and Jacob's extensive documentation about the Reichsbank gold reserves that may have been aboard the vessel. "These scans are extraordinary," Philip said, studying the images carefully. "The preservation level suggests minimal disturbance over decades. If this vessel is really carrying Nazi gold reserves that were sealed in watertight compartments before deliberate sinking, we could potentially recover valuables in remarkable condition." "Can you dive to 82 meters safely?" Aleksander asked. "Absolutely. I'm certified for technical mixed gas diving to 100 meters, and I've conducted archaeological documentation at similar depths. My equipment includes rebreathers that allow for extended bottom time and high-resolution underwater imaging systems specifically designed for archaeological documentation." "When could you conduct a preliminary survey?" "Weather permitting, I could be ready in 2 days. I'll need to prepare my equipment, arrange for proper gas mixes, and develop a detailed dive plan based on these coordinates and sonar readings." For the first time since discovering his father's research, Aleksander felt a genuine sense of hope. For the next 40 minutes, Aleksander and Maria monitored Philip's careful ascent, which included multiple decompression stops to prevent the dangerous condition known as the bends. When he finally surfaced, his face showed a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "It's everything your father claimed and more," Philip said as they helped him aboard. U-3317 is in remarkable condition. The forward cargo compartment appears to be sealed and intact, designed specifically for long-term preservation. There's no question this was a deliberate scuttling operation, not a combat loss. As they secured his equipment and began the journey back to Gdańsk, Philip reviewed the images he had captured. The high-resolution photographs and video provided clear documentation of not just the submarine's identity, but the specialized compartments it contained. "Look at this," he said, pointing to images of one of the sealed hatches. "These are pressure seals rated for extreme depths. They weren't standard features on Type XXI U-boats. This vessel was specifically modified for its final mission." Another image showed the distinctive identification number on the conning tower that had remained intact for nearly 8 decades, preserved by the unique conditions of the Baltic at that depth. "Your father was absolutely correct in his theories," Philip continued. "This submarine was deliberately prepared for scuttling. The cargo compartments were specially reinforced and sealed with materials designed for underwater preservation, and the vessel was carefully positioned on that seamount system to minimize deterioration." As the Jakob N approached Gdańsk, Aleksander's satellite phone rang with a call from Natalia Kamiska. "Aleksander, we have a situation. Baltic Salvage has filed a competing salvage claim based on alleged surveys conducted in 2021. They're seeking an emergency injunction to prevent your team from accessing the site while their claim is reviewed." "They're lying," Aleksander replied. "They only appeared at the site after we began our survey this morning. We have video evidence of their arrival." "That's excellent. Document everything. I'm filing our counter-response immediately, including Professor Kowalski's academic validation and the evidence you sent from this morning's dive. The good news is that your father's dated sonar readings from 2022 establish clear priority. Their retroactive claim won't stand up to scrutiny." After ending the call, Aleksander felt both vindicated and concerned. They had proven Jacob's theories correct, secured critical evidence of U-3317's identity and cargo compartments, and established their legal priority to the discovery. But they had also attracted powerful opposition that would use every available means to seize control of what might be the most valuable World War II shipwreck discovered in Baltic waters in decades. As they secured the Jakob N to their weathered dock, Aleksander noticed several expensive cars parked near their property. Men with cameras and recording equipment were approaching, not the threatening presence of Baltic Salvage's team, but journalists who had somehow learned of the potential discovery. Pan Nowak called a woman whom Aleksander recognized from regional television news. "We've received reports that you've discovered U-3317 with its cargo of Nazi gold. Can you confirm these reports?" Aleksander exchanged a glance with Maria, who nodded slightly. With commercial interests already making competing claims, public disclosure might actually provide some protection. "We can confirm that we have located and documented a World War II German submarine at coordinates discovered by my father, Jakob Nowak," Aleksander stated carefully. "Initial evidence strongly suggests this is indeed U-3317, which disappeared in 1945. We have filed appropriate salvage claims and are working with academic and heritage authorities to ensure proper archaeological protocols are followed." "Is it true the vessel contains Nazi gold reserves worth over $400 million? Asked another reporter. "Our survey has documented sealed cargo compartments bearing specialized pressure seals," Aleksander replied, avoiding specific claims about content or value. "The historical record suggests these compartments may hold significant Reichsbank assets that were being evacuated during the final days of World War II. Until these compartments are properly recovered and examined by experts, we cannot speculate about specific contents." As journalists continued shouting questions, Aleksander's phone rang again. The caller ID displayed Polish Ministry of Cultural Heritage. "Pan Nowak, this is Director Tomasz Zalewski from the Ministry's Underwater Cultural Heritage Division. We've been informed of your discovery and have reviewed your preliminary documentation. This find appears to be of exceptional national significance. I'm calling to inform you that the Ministry is dispatching a team to Gdańsk immediately to assist with proper archaeological recovery operations." Aleksander felt simultaneous relief and concern. Government involvement would provide crucial resources and protection against commercial competitors like Baltic Salvage. But it might also lead to bureaucratic delays and potential limitations on recovery rights. "We welcome the Ministry's involvement, Director Zalewski," Aleksander replied. "We're committed to ensuring this discovery is handled with appropriate archaeological protocols while respecting our family's discovery rights." "Your rights as discoverers will be fully respected," Zalewski assured him. "Polish heritage law recognizes both the national importance of such discoveries and the legitimate interests of those who locate them. Our team includes experts in World War II maritime archaeology who can ensure proper handling of both the vessel and any cargo it contains." That evening, as international news outlets began reporting the potential discovery of Nazi gold reserves in a Baltic shipwreck, Aleksander, Maria, and Philip gathered in the small shed that had housed Jakob's research for decades. The space that had once seemed filled with an old man's impossible dreams now vibrated with the energy of validation. "What happens next?" Maria asked, her voice both excited and apprehensive as she watched her father organize the evidence they had gathered. "The Ministry team arrives tomorrow morning," Aleksander explained. "They'll work with us to develop a formal recovery plan that balances archaeological best practices with the time sensitivity created by competing claims. Philip will serve as our representative during the initial planning." "And the bank foreclosure?" she asked, the pressing reality of their financial situation temporarily overshadowed but not forgotten. Aleksander smiled for what felt like the first time in months. "Natalia called while you were helping Philip with his equipment. She's spoken with Baltic Coastal Finance. Given the validated discovery and the Ministry's involvement, they've agreed to a 30-day extension on our loan obligations. They recognize that our financial situation is likely to change dramatically in the coming weeks." Maria hugged her father tightly. Gdańsk was right all along. Everyone thought he was wasting his life chasing fantasies, but he found one of the greatest World War II discoveries in history. Aleksander nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He knew what he'd discovered. That's why he documented everything so meticulously, but kept it secret. He was protecting the find until the right moment, until it could save our family when we needed it most. Philip looked up from the technical dive logs he was completing for the ministry team. Your father was a remarkable man, Aleksander. Without formal training in naval history or archaeology, he pieced together evidence that professional researchers missed for decades. The academic papers that will come from this discovery will transform our understanding of Nazi evacuation operations during the final days of the war. The small shed, once a shrine to an old fisherman's obsession, had become the center of what would soon be recognized as one of the most significant World War II discoveries of the century. Outside, journalists continued to gather, their cameras capturing images of the modest fishing operation that had uncovered a $400 million Nazi treasure through 2 generations of persistence and belief. Aleksander gazed at the photograph of his father that hung on the wall among the research materials. Jacob Nowak had died believing that someday his family would understand the true value of his life's work. That day had finally arrived. Tomorrow, Aleksander said, we begin writing the final chapter of a story that started 8 decades ago when Nazi officials decided to hide their ill-gotten gold from advancing Allied forces. And we begin a new chapter for our family, one where the Nowak name is associated not just with fishing, but with one of the greatest historical discoveries in Baltic history. Maria placed her hand on the photograph of her grandfather. Dziękuję, Gdańsk, she said softly. You saved us just like you always said you would. Dawn broke over Gdańsk Harbor with a brilliance that seemed to herald the extraordinary day ahead. Aleksander stood on his family's dock, watching as an impressive convoy of vehicles bearing the Polish Ministry of Cultural Heritage insignia wound their way down the narrow coastal road toward the Nowak property. The modest fishing operation that had struggled in obscurity for decades was now the epicenter of what international media were already calling the historical discovery of the decade. The previous night had passed in a whirlwind of activity. After the news broke about the potential discovery of Nazi gold reserves, the Nowak phone had rung constantly with calls from journalists, historians, museum directors, and even several representatives from international auction houses. Aleksander had instructed Maria to direct all inquiries to Natalia Kamiska, who was now coordinating the legal and media aspects of their discovery. It's like watching a dream materialize, Maria said, joining her father on the dock. She handed him a cup of coffee, the good imported kind they normally couldn't afford, brought as a gift by one of the local reporters. I still can't believe this is happening to us. Aleksander smiled at his daughter, noting how she stood taller today, her posture reflecting a newfound confidence that had replaced the worried tension of recent months. Your grandfather always said that persistence reveals truth eventually. He just didn't know how dramatically that truth would transform our lives. The ministry's convoy arrived at the Nowak property with precision that reflected the significance of the mission. Director Tomasz Zalewski emerged from the lead vehicle, a distinguished man in his early 60s, whose elegant appearance belied the fact that he was one of Europe's most respected naval archaeologists before assuming his current administrative position. Pan Nowak, he greeted Aleksander with genuine warmth. It's an honor to meet the son of Jacob Nowak. Your father's research was years ahead of its time. He identified patterns in historical records that our professional archaeologists missed entirely. The team Zalewski had assembled represented the elite of Poland's cultural heritage specialists, underwater archaeologists, World War II historians, technical diving experts, and specialized equipment operators. Within an hour, They had transformed the modest Nowak processing facility into a sophisticated command center with computer systems, mapping technology, and conservation equipment ready for the recovery operation. Our priority is creating a comprehensive recovery plan that balances archaeological best practices with the urgency created by competing claims, Zalewski explained as his team organized their equipment. Normally, a discovery of this magnitude would involve months of preliminary survey work before any artifacts were disturbed. However, the ministry recognizes the unique circumstances here. Those unique circumstances became clearer when Natalia Kamiska arrived with disturbing news. Baltic Salvage has escalated their competing claim, she told Aleksander privately. They've hired one of Poland's most aggressive maritime law firms and are seeking an emergency hearing with the International Maritime Salvage Tribunal in Hamburg. Their legal team is flying there this afternoon. On what grounds? Aleksander asked. We have documented evidence of my father's prior discovery. They're challenging the authentication of Jacob's sonar readings, claiming they could have been created recently and artificially dated. It's a desperate tactic that won't ultimately succeed, but it could potentially delay our operations while the tribunal reviews the evidence. Director Zalewski joined their conversation, his expression serious. This is precisely why we must accelerate our recovery timeline. The ministry has authorized an emergency extraction of key diagnostic artifacts that will definitively establish the vessel's identity and historical significance. Once those artifacts are in ministry custody, competing commercial claims become much more difficult to pursue. By mid-morning, the operation was proceeding with remarkable efficiency. The ministry had deployed a specialized recovery vessel equipped with advanced WWII, remotely operated vehicle technology that could document and extract selected artifacts with minimal disturbance to the overall site. Philip Adamski had been invited to join the ministry's dive team, providing continuity with the initial discovery while gaining invaluable professional experience. Aleksander, you should come aboard the recovery vessel, Zalewski suggested. As the recognized discoverer, your presence during the initial recovery adds important legal validation to the process. Your daughter is welcome as well. It seems fitting that 2 generations of Nowaks should be part of this historic moment. The ministry's recovery vessel, the Baltic Explorer, was a marvel of modern archaeological technology, a 38 meters research ship specifically designed for underwater cultural heritage operations. As Aleksander and Maria boarded, they were escorted to the ship's advanced control room, where multiple screens displayed real-time images from the ROVs, now documenting the wreck site in extraordinary detail. The preliminary scans confirm what your diver reported yesterday, explained Dr. Wojciech Majewski, the ministry's lead underwater archaeologist. The submarine's preservation is remarkable, and the specialized cargo compartments appear intact. We're focusing initial recovery efforts on 3 priorities: the commander's logbook, which should contain the vessel's final orders and mission details; one of the smaller cargo containers that shows minimal deterioration; and the submarine's identification plate, which will definitively establish its identity as U3317. Aleksander watched in awe as the ROV operators navigated their sophisticated equipment with precision that seemed almost miraculous. The high-definition cameras revealed details of U3317 that even Philip's excellent documentation hadn't captured. Intricate mechanical systems still intact after decades underwater. The organized arrangement of the interior compartments that clearly indicated a planned scuttling rather than a combat sinking. And most impressively, the sealed cargo areas that had been specially modified to preserve their contents indefinitely. There, exclaimed Dr. Majewski, pointing to one of the screens, the identification plate, exactly where naval construction practices would position it. The ROV's mechanical arm gently cleared away marine growth from the metal plate, revealing ornate lettering that confirmed beyond any doubt U-3317 Kriegsmarine 1944, along with the Bremen shipyard's identifying mark. A cheer erupted in the control room as the ROV carefully detached the plate from its mounting and secured it in a specialized recovery container. The first definitive artifact from the legendary lost U-boat was now being brought to the surface, validating 2 generations of Nowak family belief in Jacob's theories. "We're moving to the cargo compartments now," Dr. Majewski announced. "Based on the visible pressure seals and the specialized construction, we've identified the smallest sealed container as the priority target. Its dimensions and location are consistent with how high-value financial assets would have been transported during this period." Alexander felt his heart racing as the ROV approached the carefully arranged cargo hold. The containers visible on the monitors were unlike typical submarine storage units. These were specially constructed metal cases reinforced with lead shielding and sealed with advanced pressure systems designed specifically for long-term preservation. With exquisite care, the ROV operators maneuvered their equipment to extract the smallest container. A rectangular case approximately 60 centimeters by 40 centimeters, consistent with the dimensions of a standard gold bullion transport box from the period. The container was secured in a specialized preservation tank that would maintain the exact environmental conditions of the wreck site, preventing any shock or deterioration during the transition to the surface. The recovery of this container is a watershed moment in World War II history, Zalewski told Alexander as they watched the ROV begin its ascent. "If your father's theories are correct, and all evidence suggests they are, we may be about to rediscover financial assets that have been missing from historical record for 8 decades. As the container was carefully brought aboard the Baltic Explorer, Maria grasped her father's hand tightly. "Gdańsk is watching this," she whispered. "He knew this day would come eventually." The container was transferred to a specialized conservation laboratory on the ship, a pristine environment where experts in World War II artifact preservation waited with the tools and expertise to begin the delicate process of examining the artifact without compromising its condition. "We'll proceed with extreme caution," explained Dr. Halina Veselevska, the ministry's senior conservator for metal artifacts. "The container will first undergo non-invasive imaging, X-ray scanning and ultrasonic analysis that will reveal the contents without opening the seals. Only after we understand exactly what we're dealing with will we consider opening the container." The scanning process took nearly 3 hours, during which Alexander and Maria waited with growing anticipation. The control room had fallen silent, the usual technical chatter replaced by an almost reverent hush as the team recognized they were witnessing a moment that would be recorded in history books for generations to come. Dr. Veselevska finally emerged from the laboratory, her expression a mixture of professional composure and barely contained excitement. "Pan Nowak, the scans have confirmed that the container houses multiple rectangular objects consistent with the dimensions of standard Reichsbank gold bars, approximately 5 kilograms each. Based on the density readings, the material is almost certainly gold of high purity." Alexander felt a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "You believe it's part of the Reichsbank reserves that disappeared in 1945? The container construction and security seals match historical records precisely," Dr. Veselevska confirmed. "Furthermore, there are visible stampings on several of the bars that appear to be standard Reichsbank markings from the period. While final authentication will require careful examination after conservation, I would stake my professional reputation on these being part of the missing Nazi gold reserve from the Berlin vaults." Director Zalewski stepped forward, his expression solemn. "Alexander, do you understand what this means? Your father discovered not just a historically significant shipwreck, but potentially one of the most important World War II financial finds of the past 8 decades. The historical value transcends the substantial monetary worth of the gold itself." Within hours, the recovery team had successfully brought 2 more artifacts to the surface: a waterproof case containing remarkably preserved logbook pages and a small brass box bearing the personal seal of U-3317's captain, Franz Lehmann. The logbook pages, written in the meticulous hand of Captain Lehmann, provided the final confirmation of Jacob's theories. The entry, dated April 22, 1945, read, "Of Reichsbank Director Walter Funk, we have prepared U-3317 according to the special instructions provided. The classified cargo has been secured in the manner specified by the engineering team. We sail tonight under sealed orders. May God protect our mission of preservation." Subsequent entries detailed the careful journey to the predetermined location and the meticulous preparations for what Captain Lehmann called the vessel's final rest. The final entry, dated April 28, 1945, stated simply, "All is prepared as instructed. The financial reserves will remain secure until such time as they may be reclaimed by the proper authorities. U-3317 will guard her precious cargo in the depths until Germany rises again." By late afternoon, news of the confirmed gold discovery had spread worldwide. Media helicopters circled above Gdańsk Harbor. International news crews crowded the small dock, and historians from major museums were already arriving in Poland, hoping to witness what many were calling the archaeological discovery of the decade. Aleksander's phone rang with a call from Natalia Kamiska. "Aleksander, the ministry's confirmation of the gold bullion has transformed our legal position entirely. The International Maritime Salvage Tribunal has issued an emergency ruling granting exclusive recovery rights to the ministry in partnership with you as the recognized discoverer. Baltic Salvage's competing claim has been dismissed with prejudice." "That's wonderful news," Aleksander replied, watching as the ministry team carefully transferred the precious artifacts to specialized transport vehicles for the journey to Warsaw, where they would undergo complete conservation treatment at the National Institute for Historical Preservation. "It gets better," Natalia continued. "Baltic Coastal Finance has withdrawn their foreclosure proceedings entirely. Their CEO personally called to apologize for the misunderstanding and to offer a complete restructuring of your loans on extremely favorable terms. It seems they're eager to be associated with the family that discovered the Nazi gold submarine, as the media are now calling it." Aleksander laughed softly. "Amazing how our creditworthiness improved overnight." "That's just the beginning," Natalia sighed. "I've received preliminary authorization from the ministry regarding the discoverer's compensation rights. Under Polish cultural heritage law, while the artifacts themselves become national treasures, the discoverers are entitled to a significant finder's fee based on assessed cultural and historical value. The initial estimates suggest your family will receive approximately 22 million zloty in recognition of Jacob's discovery." The figure was staggering, far more than Aleksander had ever imagined possible. It would not only save their home and business, but transform their lives entirely. Yet somehow, the validation of his father's life's work felt even more valuable than the financial reward. As evening settled over Gdańsk Harbor, the ministry team prepared to depart with their precious cargo. Director Zalewski approached Aleksander and Maria, who stood watching the final preparations from their dock. "Your family has given an incomparable gift to Polish history," Zalewski said warmly. "The gold itself is extraordinary, but the logbook entries suggest we've only begun to discover what U-3317 contains. The larger sealed compartments likely hold additional financial reserves and potentially significant historical documents that have been lost to human knowledge for 8 decades. "What happens next?" Maria asked. "A comprehensive recovery operation will begin immediately," Zalewski explained. "The ministry will establish a permanent base here in Gdańsk for the duration of the project, likely 18 to 24 months of careful archaeological work. As the recognized discoverers, your family will be integral to the entire process. In fact, we would like to offer you an official position, Aleksander, as historical consultant to the project. Your background in military history, combined with your father's research, makes you uniquely qualified. Aleksander felt a surge of emotion at the thought of returning to the academic work he had loved, while still honoring his family's maritime legacy. I would be honored, Director. And we've spoken with the University of Warsaw, Zalewski continued, turning to Maria. They've expressed interest in offering you early admission to their history program with a full scholarship. Your role in this discovery has not gone unnoticed, and they believe you show remarkable promise. Maria's eyes widened with shock and delight. Really? I could study history like Tata. You could continue your family's legacy of discovering and preserving our national heritage. Zalewski smiled. Perhaps someday you'll lead recovery operations like this one. Later that night, Aleksander sat with Maria on their dock, watching the lights of the ministry vessels as they maintained security around the wreck site. The small harbor of Gdańsk, once struggling with declining fishing yields, now buzzed with activity as international media, historians, and curious tourists filled every available accommodation. I keep thinking about how Gdańsk spent his whole life being ridiculed for his obsession, Maria said softly. Everyone said he was wasting his time chasing fantasies when he should have been focusing on practical matters. Aleksander nodded, remembering the countless arguments he and his father had engaged in over the resources Jacob had dedicated to his research. He never wavered in his conviction. Even when everyone, including his own family, thought he was being foolish, he kept methodically building his case, gathering evidence, connecting historical dots that no one else could see. He knew the truth would emerge eventually, Maria said. He just didn't know it would save our family when we needed it most. Aleksander put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, gazing out at the Baltic waters that had defined their family for generations. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't operate on our preferred timeline. Your grandfather spent 40 years pursuing evidence that others dismissed. He died without seeing his theories validated. But he never lost faith that someday the truth would matter. And it did, Maria affirmed. It saved everything we might have lost. The following morning brought another extraordinary development. Dr. Wasilewska called from Warsaw, where the conservation team had begun their detailed examination of the gold bars. Aleksander, we've made a disturbing discovery, she said, her voice tense with the weight of historical revelation. Using specialized imaging techniques, we've detected unique molecular signatures in the gold that match samples known to have been processed from jewelry and dental work seized from concentration camp victims. These bars aren't just Nazi financial assets, they're physical evidence of Holocaust crimes. What does that mean for the recovery operation? Aleksander asked, feeling a chill at the implication. The ministry has reclassified the entire project as a Holocaust memorial recovery. This elevates the historical significance enormously and changes how we'll handle the artifacts. Rather than being valued purely for their gold content, these bars will be preserved as evidence of Nazi atrocities and eventually displayed in museums as a permanent reminder of those crimes. Aleksander felt a profound shift in his understanding of his father's discovery. Jacob hadn't just found lost gold, he had uncovered critical evidence that would help document one of history's greatest crimes. 1 month after the initial discovery, Aleksander stood in the magnificent conservation laboratory in Warsaw, watching as experts carefully extracted documents from a waterproof case, recovered from U-3317's officers' quarters. The first gold bars had already been stabilized and were undergoing final authentication. Now, with even greater anticipation, the team prepared to reveal another set of historical documents that had been hidden from human eyes for nearly 8 decades. As the specialized environmental chamber was opened, revealing the paper contents for the first time, an audible gasp swept through the room. The documents showed a detailed ledger of gold and valuables seized from Jewish victims across occupied Europe, a meticulous accounting of stolen wealth that directly implicated dozens of German banking officials in Holocaust crimes. Most significantly, the documents included transfer orders signed by several banking families whose descendants still controlled major European financial institutions. "It's beyond our highest expectations," Dr. Vasilevska whispered, her professional composure momentarily overwhelmed by the significance of the discovery. These documents provide direct evidence linking specific financial institutions to Holocaust crimes. Historians have suspected these connections for decades, but direct documentary proof has been elusive until now. 6 months later, as the recovery operation continued with meticulous care, the Nazi gold submarine, as it had become known worldwide, had transformed not just the Nowak family, but the entire community of Gdańsk. The modest fishing village area had become an international historical destination with museums, research facilities, and educational centers established to support the ongoing work. The Nowak fishing business had evolved into the Nowak Maritime Heritage Center, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to Baltic underwater archaeological research and education. Aleksander served as its director, balancing his official role with the ministry's recovery operation and his academic position at the University of Warsaw, where he now lectured on World War II history and maritime archaeology. Maria had begun her university studies with unprecedented opportunities, already participating in advanced research projects despite her freshman status. Her unique perspective as both a descendant of the discoverer and a student of history made her insights particularly valuable to the international team of scholars studying the U-3317 archives. Most significantly, Jacob Nowak's reputation had been completely transformed. The man once dismissed as an eccentric obsessive was now recognized as a pioneering independent researcher whose methodologies had identified historical patterns that professional archaeologists and historians had missed entirely. His comprehensive research journals were being published by the University of Warsaw Press, and a documentary about his 40-year quest was in production by an international film studio. "Your father would be proud beyond words," Hannah told Aleksander one evening as they sat on the terrace of their renovated home, watching the lights of the research vessels offshore. Her health had stabilized with access to advanced treatments that had previously been financially out of reach. "Not just of the discovery itself, but of how you've honored his legacy by ensuring it benefits our entire community, not just our family." Aleksander nodded, watching as tourists and researchers filled the once quiet harbor below. The financial security brought by the finder's fee had allowed him to establish the Jacob Nowak Foundation, which provided scholarships for local students interested in historical research and grants for independent researchers pursuing unconventional historical theories. "He understood something that took me years to learn," Aleksander reflected. "The value of persistence in the face of doubt. Everyone, including me at times, thought he was wasting his life chasing shadows. But he kept methodically building his case year after year, because he believed the truth was worth pursuing, regardless of whether he lived to see it validated." The Nazi gold submarine had indeed transformed their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The 7 tons of gold, now carefully preserved and studied by experts from around the world, were valued at over $400 million, far more than the initial estimates. They represented not just financial assets, but a historical revelation about the extent of Nazi plunder and the complicity of financial institutions in Holocaust crimes. The most profound transformation, however, was in how Aleksander viewed his own path. The years he had spent feeling like a failure, a military historian reduced to struggling as a fisherman, now revealed themselves as essential preparation for the role he was meant to play. Without his academic background and his practical maritime experience, he could never have bridged the gap between Jacob's theories and their validation. What had seemed like a detour had actually been the journey itself, each apparent setback positioning him perfectly for the moment when past and present. Academic knowledge and practical skill would need to converge. 1 year to the day after the discovery, Aleksander and Maria stood on their dock at dawn, watching the sun rise over the research vessels that still worked methodically to recover the treasures and historical evidence of U-3317. Gdańsk used to stand right here every morning, Maria said, looking out at these same waters, believing in what no one else could see. Aleksander nodded, feeling a profound connection to his father's spirit. He taught us the most valuable lesson of all that. Truth doesn't conform to other people's expectations or operate on their timelines. Sometimes it waits 8 decades to be discovered. Sometimes it requires 2 generations of persistence to be revealed. And sometimes, Maria added with a smile, it arrives just when a family needs it most. The story of the Nazi gold submarine would be told for generations, how a humble fisherman's 40-year obsession led to one of history's greatest World War II discoveries. How a family on the brink of losing everything found not just financial salvation, but their true purpose. And how persistence in the face of doubt and ridicule ultimately vindicated a lifetime of dedication. But for Aleksander, standing beside his daughter as they watched the sun illuminate the waters that had defined their family for generations, the most precious treasure wasn't measured in millions of zloty or gold bullion. It was the legacy of unwavering belief that Jacob Nowak had instilled in them, the understanding that some truths are worth pursuing for a lifetime, even when the whole world tells you you're chasing shadows. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.